Hi guys, today in this video we will study about introduction part in Linux distribution. Before we understand the concept of Linux, little bit let's understand what the Unix is. Unix is an operating system developed by AT&T's Bell Labs in mid-1970. Most Unix operating systems are not free and you need to pay. Initially, Unix is designed to run in mainframes and servers. The code used to create the Unix OS is closed and cannot modify by the community. As an example, you can take OS X. Either you can call this one as Mac OS X. It's a proprietary operating system owned by Apple company. You can see this operating system in Apple device such as MacBook, which we are using nowadays. The second example for Unix operating system is Sun Solaris. It's also a proprietary operating system originally developed by Sun Microsystems. In 2010, Sun acquisition by Oracle, then it was renamed as Oracle Solaris. The third example for the Unix operating system, IBM AIX, Advanced Interactive Executive. It's also a series of proprietary Unix operating system developed and sold by IBM for several of its computer platforms. So next let's study about Linux. What is Linux? Linux came from Unix operating system. It is based on Linux kernel. So what is Linux kernel we will study later. Linux is an open source and mostly free operating system, which means that you can use, copy, study, and also you can change the software the way you want. It is distributed with the source code. There are millions of source code and the source code can be modified and distributed to anyone commercially or non-commercially, but under the GNU General Public License. Linux is developed by Linus Torvalds and released in 1991. Initially, Linux was created for personal computer. Then slowly it was used in other machines like servers, mainframe computers and supercomputers. Nowadays, even Linux is also used in embedded systems like routers, digital video recorders, video game consoles, smartwatches, and especially smartphone and tablet, which is installed with Android operating system. And one thing you must keep in mind, Linux isn't developed by a single organization, developed by large number of communities and open source projects. That's what you can see. There are many Linux distributions exist in the Linux. So now let's come to the point of distribution. What is Linux distribution? A Linux distribution is simply an operating system built from Linux kernel and supporting user programs and libraries. Linux distribution, sometimes you can call this one as distro in short. There are many Linux distributions, near about over 600 Linux distributions you can see nowadays. Some of the most popular Linux distributions are Debian, Ubuntu, CentOS, Red Hat, Fedora, OpenSUSE, and etc. Each one of them working with different individual software components. I will recommend you this particular website, www.distrowatch.com, to get brief introduction about each of these Linux distributions. Here in this website you can see information regarding each distribution. Also you can download the ISO file relevant to each distribution for the installation purpose. So here initially I will choose a distribution which I want to see. For example, if I want to get information about Red Hat distribution, then you have to click the drop down menu from the distribution. Then you can choose the distribution what you want. I am selecting Red Hat. Once I select Red Hat, then it will list out all the information specific to Red Hat Enterprise Linux distribution. As you can see here, its OS type is Linux based on Fedora. Here most of the Linux distributions are based on another Linux distribution. Here original OS is Fedora. From the Fedora only this Red Hat was created, and very few of them are independent. For example, Fedora, Debian, OpenSUSE, FreeBSD, these kind of Linux distributions are independent, right? So it didn't come from another Linux distribution, right? So if you see Red Hat, it's based on Fedora. If I want to get information about Fedora, from drop down menu I can select Fedora. OS type Linux, it is independent, right? So it is not based on any of other Linux distribution, so it is independent. And Fedora developed by community supported Fedora project and owned by Red Hat organization. Then they took Fedora distribution and make some custom changes, then named that distribution as Red Hat. So now Red Hat is high demand industry certification that you can achieve nowadays. And if you study CentOS, then you can take exam in Red Hat Linux distribution, because CentOS is based on Red Hat and Fedora. So Fedora is independent, Red Hat based on Fedora, and CentOS based on Fedora and Linux distribution. So if you study CentOS, which means you can take exam in Red Hat, it is similar Linux distribution that you can study nowadays. As you can see here, CentOS OS type Linux based on Fedora and Red Hat. Even Red Hat is based on Fedora. Fedora is independent, right? And if you see Ubuntu, it is based on Debian Linux distribution. So if I select Ubuntu, here you can notice it is based on Debian, but Debian it is independent Linux distribution. And nowadays Linux is used for unified communication and software based firewall also. As an example, Elastic's is Linux distribution based on Debian and used as VoIP servers in the network environment, right? Next, pfSense, it is based on FreeBSD. You can use it as firewall and router. It will be considered as software based firewall. So pfSense, it's a free open source customized distribution of FreeBSD. It was designed to run as firewall or router in your environment, and it will be used as software based firewall and entirely managed via web interface, as you can see in the picture. Most popular and high demand Linux distributions are CentOS, Red Hat, Ubuntu, Debian. Here in this series we will study about Ubuntu Linux distribution from basic to advanced. There are certain major differences that you can notice between Linux and Windows. I will list out some of the main major differences. One is source code access. The most significant difference between Windows and Linux is having access to the source code. In Linux distribution, users can access and modify the source code in any way they wish. But Windows considered to be a closed source software and you cannot modify it. The second major difference between Linux and Windows, price. Linux distributions are generally free, but in Windows you have to pay for the license, so Windows can cost money. The third difference, ease of access. Linux is not user friendly, but still can get experience by using them in day-to-day life. And Windows is user friendly, also easy to learn and use. Next, resource consumption. When you compare Linux distributions with Windows operating system, Linux distributions are less resource intensive, which means it will not consume that much RAM and CPU from your PC. So performance wise, Linux is more preferred as compared to Windows operating systems. You might have noticed in Windows that you can verify once you start Windows initially, it will start lot of services in the background automatically. So it will be called as startup services. It will consume that much processor and RAM from physical PC. You have to manually stop those services if you don't want. That kind of high resource intensive problems you will not face with Linux distributions. Next, command line. Windows has command prompt. Even sometime average user doesn't know that there is a command line tool in Windows. The reason behind it is not mostly usable as compared to Linux. Still, administrators can use Windows without command line tool. In Linux, command line tool will be called as Linux shell or shell terminal. It is more powerful as compared to command line in Windows. For the system administrators, the Linux shell always be a valuable tool for the administration purpose. The next major difference between Linux and Windows: security. Linux is more secure in comparison to Windows operating system, but cannot say it is completely secure. Still, there is some malware, but it is less vulnerable than Windows. Every program in Linux, whether an application or a virus, needs authorization from the administrator in the form of password. That's all about this video. In the next video, I will show you how to install Ubuntu Linux distribution using various methods. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please consider subscribe my YouTube channel for more videos.